Good evening, and welcome to Keese School. You're in for a treat tonight after talking with Jim and listening to his stories. He's got a lot of great stuff. In 1962, the CIA envisioned a coup to get rid of Castro. President John Kennedy and the CIA decided the coup should be triggered by Castro's assassination. The CIA met in Paris to provide weapons to the assassins. Later, John F. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas. Were the events related? The Warren Commission that investigated the murder was never told about the CIA's plot to kill Castro. Now, a little bit about Jim Johnson. He's a lawyer, journalist, lecturer. He has writings that appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, White House History, the Times of Washington, American Lawyer Magazine, and a bunch of historical. So let's welcome Jim.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for coming. The good thing about an older community like this is I don't need to tell you who John Kennedy is. I'm serious. Anyway, the book is Murder, Inc., and that's what my talk's going to be about tonight. The title of the book came from Lyndon Johnson, who was asked after he left office what he thought happened with Kennedy, and he said, "I think Castro killed him." And the reporter said, "Well, why do you think that?" And Lyndon Johnson said, "Because Kennedy was running a damn Murder, Inc. in the Caribbean and trying to kill Castro." So that's the title of the book. My expertise is going to be to raise these questions to you as I talk, because I'm going to talk for 50 minutes. And so during the talk, think, did John Kennedy authorize the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro? Did Lyndon Johnson, I see these are all numbered 1, did Lyndon Johnson authorize the CIA to cover up the assassination plot? And finally, are the CIA's secrecy and compartmentation and plausible denial practices consistent with democracy? And you know what secrecy is, compartmentation means. A lot of you have been in intelligence agencies. You know that if you don't need to know something, you don't have access to it. But plausible denial needs a little bit of explanation. When the CIA is caught with its hand in the cookie jar, it should have a plausible denial to be able to say plausibly, we didn't do it. But even if they are caught, and it can be proved that the CIA did it, then plausible denial means that the President of the United States should be able to say, plausibly, I didn't know. So that's what we're talking about with these. My expertise comes from having been first on the Church Committee in 1975, 1976, that investigated the intelligence agencies named after Frank Church of Idaho. That's John Tower of Texas, Republican. And I actually did this hearing on, we called it Bugs and Drugs, about the poisons and bacterial weapons that the CIA had developed, and that was a dart gun, compressed air dart gun to assassinate people. So that's where I first got interested in this. And then eventually I wrote a book, but these files, a lot of the files on this have now been declassified, and I used those in the book, and you'll see some of the material from that. Starting with John Kennedy. I know you know who he was, but this is John Kennedy when he was first elected to Congress in 1947, his first term in Congress. You know, it was said about him that people watching him on television smiled. He was so charismatic, and you can, if you're looking at that now, I look at it and I smile. You know, this guy is really charismatic. But this was in the late 1940s, and you know, the communist threat was the big thing there. And so Kennedy, you know, China had fallen to the communists, and the Republicans were accusing the Democrats of losing China. All the communist Red Scare was going on. So John Kennedy said to himself in 1947 and throughout his political career, I'm not going to let anybody get to the right of me on anti-communism. So he was staunchly anti-communist, and that was part of his congressional policies, his Senate policies, and his presidency. But the funny thing that happened as he's about to get elected president, in 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba. And that's Fidel. That's Che Guevara. By the way, the word Che is really a slang for an Argentinian. That's not a name. It's just any Argentinian in Latin America is called Che. It's not a very happy term, but he liked it. He was a communist. Fidel Castro at this time was not, and he had overthrown Juan Batista. And on January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. And so this is the victory celebration in Cuba. In the famous 1960 debates between Kennedy and Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president, Kennedy sort of turned the tables on the Republican and said, I was not part of an administration that lost Cuba. So he's throwing that back. So bear in mind throughout this that he was just adamant about fighting communism. In fact, in his inaugural address, which, ask not what you can do for your country, but what, other way around, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. He actually spent a lot of that talking about foreign policy and said this: let all our neighbors know that we shall join them with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. And that's in his inaugural address. He's using the word subversion because Kennedy had this anti-communism view that the communists had been taking over the world. World War II ended, they'd taken over Eastern Europe by military force. But by the time Kennedy was president, that was off the table. But they were using subversion. They were doing what they did in Cuba, which is to get someone to have a revolution and appoint a new leader who is a communist or at least pro-communist. So that's what he's talking about. And the two areas that Kennedy identified where he wanted to roll back communism were Cuba and Vietnam. Vietnam had not fallen to the communists, but he wanted to prove that they could not take over that country. Now, even before he got elected, the CIA had started this business of assassinating Castro. And the CIA men, they come from Princeton and Harvard and Yale, and this business of killing people is not in their nature, and they don't know how to do it. So they turned to the people they thought knew how to do it, which was the mafia. And they turned to Sam Giancana, boss of Chicago, and they had access to him. And so he said, well, I like to try to be a godfather. It's not, I don't do this very well. You need Johnny Roselli from Las Vegas. So they got Johnny Roselli from Las Vegas, the man in the center. And he was the CIA contact for the whole time that they were running underworld plots to assassinate Castro. Now they thought, I guess the CIA thought, that the underworld had people with machine guns and they'd walk into Havana and shoot up Castro. But Giancana said, we don't do that kind of thing. Our hitmen, they like to go home and have dinner with their families. So they're not going to go shoot up Castro in Havana. They want some device so they can kill him and then escape, get him sick. And so they landed mainly on poisons. And they brought into the plot this last man, Santo Trafficante. And he had a couple of advantages. Number one was his father had run the casinos in Havana under Batista. Castro had closed those down. And so Santos Trafficante was going back and forth between Tampa and Cuba trying to get the casinos reopened. He also spoke Spanish, which was a big asset. So he could take, what they really settled on usually was a poison pill. Put it in Castro's food, he eats it, but in a half hour later, he starts showing symptoms, but by that time, the killer can get away. So he was carrying the poisons back and forth into Cuba. One of the plots roughly in January of 1961, as Kennedy was getting inaugurated, was at this restaurant, which is still in Havana. My Spanish is not terribly good, but it's Monta Catini. They had a cook here. This is still operating, one of the best restaurants in Havana still. And they had a cook here there who was willing to put poison in Castro's food. But for some reason that failed. And so John Kennedy was adamant about getting Castro out of there. And so what they did next was 3 months later was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they sent 1,300 Cuban exiles into the Bay of Pigs. It lived up to its name. It was a disaster. And all of 1,300 were either killed or captured. Most of them were captured. This is some of the prisoners. The United States had military forces off the coast. They had aircraft and naval ships that could have supported the invasion, but Kennedy refused to do that. He didn't want to escalate. As a result, throughout the Cuban community, both in Cuba and in the United States, Kennedy was considered a chicken. That when times got tough, he wouldn't back it up. So that was something he would have to fight for literally the rest of his life. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, this was a CIA. They held investigations and they decided that the CIA director had to be replaced. And the man they looked for was John Kennedy's brother, Robert. He was the Attorney General. He had run Kennedy's campaign for Senate and his presidential campaign. So he was Kennedy's chief political advisor. And Cuba was a political problem because Kennedy needed the votes in Florida in the 64 election. He had won Florida in the 60 election. And if he continued with his reputation of being a chicken, he might lose Florida. So they decided to put, or at least John Kennedy wanted to put his brother as director of the CIA. And that's where plausible denial comes in. They said, look, if your brother is director of CIA and the CIA does something wrong, you can't deny that you knew about it because he's your brother. So Robert Kennedy stayed at Justice Department as the Attorney General, but everything dealing with Cuba had to go through him. So he was actually de facto running Cuba. They put John McCone in as CIA director. To run the Cuban operations, the CIA picked this man. His name was Bill Harvey. He had been an FBI agent, got a great reputation. Then he switched to the CIA. He had a great reputation there. He had a couple of little quirks that weren't too good. He smoked. He was overweight. He was an alcoholic. And he didn't like the Kennedys. And for him having to deal with Robert Kennedy was obviously not the best kind of arrangement. It is said that he carried a pistol between the cheeks of his rear end because no one would search there. When he and Robert Kennedy first met, Robert Kennedy supposedly said, "Are you our James Bond?" He's not. So it wasn't a very happy relationship. That went on for a year, and not much happened in Cuba. Kennedy wanted to get Castro out of there, but Bill Harvey, other than trying to kill Castro, and he was actually meeting with Johnny Roselli to do this, other than that, they were blowing up things in Cuba, but there was no overall scheme for what to be done. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in October of 1962. The Russians had been far ahead of the United States in at least what they were doing with Cuba. And these missiles could strike the United States with atomic weapons. Kennedy stared down Khrushchev, took us to near World War III, and Khrushchev backed down. But part of that deal, under the table, not really said, was an agreement by Kennedy that as long as Castro behaved himself, Kennedy would not send military forces into Cuba. And by behaving himself, that meant, the term was used, he didn't export the revolution into other Latin American countries. So as long as Castro didn't export the revolution, Kennedy was not going to invade. And that was understood throughout the government. In Bill Harvey's place, and here they are talking about what they're going to do about it. So they said, okay, we can leave John McCone as director of the CIA, but we need a shakeup at the CIA. And so they put in two men. First was this man, you're going to see more about him later, Richard Helms. He was a professional spy. He had worked in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. He had the unique opportunity to interview Adolf Hitler as he was a reporter at the time, and he interviewed Adolf Hitler right at the outbreak of World War II. So when he entered the spy business, he had a big leg up on everyone else because he was the only man in American intelligence who had actually interviewed Hitler. And he rose up through the ranks. So by 62, he was appointed the number 2 man at the CIA. It's called the Deputy Director of Plans, the professional spy. McCone was a businessman and more political and a Republican. But now I'm going to focus on this man here, who's Desmond Fitzgerald. He had a lot of advantages over Bill Harvey. First of all, he had gone to Harvard, like the Kennedys had. So he was, Bill Harvey had gone to Indiana State. Desmond Fitzgerald had gone to Harvard. So that made a big difference in the Kennedy era. He was a Fitzgerald. It was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Desmond Fitzgerald, but John Fitzgerald Kennedy was Boston Irish. Desmond Fitzgerald was New England Protestant. His ancestors had come from Northern Ireland. John Kennedy's ancestors had come from Southern Ireland, or Ireland itself. But he also owned a home out in Middleburg. Bobby Kennedy had a home out there. They would ride horses together on weekends. So these were a very much better relationship. And right before he was picked, he had been running things in Vietnam. So he was a professional spy. In March of 1963, he had his first meeting with John Kennedy. And they talked about how to get rid of Castro. And John Kennedy said, come back with a plan, assuming you have unlimited support and resources. Well, if some of you in government, if you're told you're going to have unlimited resources to do something, now this is fantastic. So he came back with a plan. He said, the problem is, we focus on getting rid of Castro. Well, that's not a good idea because there are people in his government who are worse than he is, like Che Guevara. He's really a communist. So we don't want to kill Castro. There's plausible denial. They never talked about killing anyone around John Kennedy that I know of, but I'm sure they did. Anyway, we're not going to just kill Castro. We're going to have a coup in Cuba. We're the CIA. We overthrow governments all the time. We know how to do coups. So he said, the way you do a coup is you get a bunch of military people. They're the ones with the guns. You go into the Capitol. You take over the government. You seize the leader. You grab the radio stations, and voila, you got a coup. Kennedy liked that idea. And he gave him the green light. The problem they had, though, at that point, this is about April of 1963, the problem they had was they didn't have a charismatic man to lead that coup. So they searched around, and there are lots of documents. And I should say at this point, when these files were declassified beginning in 1998, a lot of this material, top secret documents, are turned over to the National Archives and made public. And those are my sources. I'm not making this stuff up. But this was not stuff that anybody knew in 1963. This is all secret stuff. So they finally got a list of military people, and they picked their candidate to lead the coup. It was this man, Rolando Cubello. He had a lot of assets and reasons for it. He had been in the revolution with Castro, so he was considered one of the heroes of the revolution, 7 of them. So he's one of the top 7 men in Cuba. He was a medical doctor, although, that's sort of iffy. He was popular. He had led the student group in the revolution, so he was considered, sort of the liberal revolutionary. He was young. He hated Che. He was not a communist, and he thought Che should get out. So all of that added up to him. He was like deputy foreign minister, so he had the ability to leave Cuba so the CIA could meet with him. That's an important thing. If you're going to run a spy, you have to be able to meet with him. And finally, and not least important, was he had killed a man. He had assassinated someone during the revolution. So he was a trigger man. He would pull a trigger if need be. So they settled on him. They had met with Cubello prior summer, but in the fall of 1963, after they picked him, they set up a meeting with him through a friend in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And he went to Porto Alegre because there were Latin American games there. And he was leading the athletes and, sort of the ambassador from Cuba. And September 7th is an important day because on September 7th, 1963, in Porto Alegre, Brazil, the CIA met with Kubela and they said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think we ought to get rid of Castro. We ought to get rid of Che, the SOB, and I want to kill Castro." And the CIA said, "Well, calm down. We're talking about a coup. We're not just going to kill him." And so that went back and forth. But that was the meeting on September 7th in Porto Alegre, Brazil. That very night, September 7th, 1963, at the Brazilian embassy in Havana, Cuba, Fidel Castro showed up. He pulled aside an American reporter who carried this story. Premier Fidel Castro said tonight that the United States leaders would be in danger if they helped any attempt to do away with the leaders of Cuba. Denouncing what he called recent United States prompted raids on Cuban territory, Castro said, and these are quotes, "We are prepared to fight them and answer in kind. United States leaders should be mindful that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, which was exactly what they were doing on September 7th in Brazil, they themselves will not be safe. You guys Kennedy keep doing this, I'll kill him." Now, there was an intergovernmental group that studied this. And Kennedy had a big intergovernmental group to do all things Cuban. And they studied this and they said, Castro's never said anything this violent before. So they said, well, what might he do? What's he talking about? Well, it took him about a month to, how government works. It takes about a month. It took him about a month to decide what to do. And they finally said, well, he might kill a Marine guard at Guantanamo. Or he might blow up an oil refinery in Guatemala. Or he might kill an American businessman. He might even assassinate one of our diplomats in Latin America. The one thing they didn't look at was whether he would kill Kennedy, which is exactly what he had threatened on the same day that Kennedy had met with Kubela. So they never told the FBI or Secret Service that they had a credible threat that Castro was threatening to kill the president. So in September of 1963, you see on the right there, September 7th, that's the meeting. And I'm bringing Oswald into this a little bit. On September 17th, Oswald was living in Louisiana. He had been in Russia from 1959 to 1962, come to the United States with a Russian wife and settled finally in Louisiana, New Orleans. But all of a sudden, out of the blue, Oswald got a visa to Mexico. And this is my little diversion on what Oswald was doing. So Oswald goes down to Mexico City, goes to the Cuban consulate there and said, "I want a visa to Cuba." And the Cuban said, "Well, why do you want to come to Cuba?" He said, "I believe in the revolution." And the Cuban said, "Well, nah, we don't let people in that easily." In fact, they did, but that's their story. They said, "You have to go." And then he said, "Well, look, I've been to the Soviet Union. I want to go back." And they said, "Well, if you want to go to Russia, you can come through Cuba with an in-transit visa. We can give that to you right away." He said, "That's what I want to do." They said, "Go down to the Soviet consulate and get a visa to Russia." So he went to the Soviet consulate, said, "I'd like to go to Russia." The Soviet consulate said, "Hey, we have to check you out. Come back in a month or two." That's sort of, crazy little stories. The important thing tonight is that the man he met with at the Soviet consulate was Valery Kostakov. He was in the KGB, and he was in Department 13 of the KGB, which specialized in assassinations. So in fact, what you all didn't know in 1963 is that when Oswald went to Mexico City, the Warren Commission never put this out. That was a secret document. He actually met with a Soviet assassin. I don't ascribe anything to that, but let me continue my narrative. Moving away from Oswald, we go back to Kubela. He's out around, he's able to move around. He's in Europe by this time, and it's October of 1963. And Kubela tells the CIA, look, I don't like this operation too much. You want me to do a coup in Cuba, but I could get killed. And as far as I know, You guys I'm talking to are just low-level CIA people. You know, you're GS9s or something. I want to hear it from Kennedy. And he also said he wanted assassination weapons, that the CIA wanted a coup. Kubela repeatedly said, yes, but I want assassination weapons. I want rifles with telescopic sights. So on October 10th, Paris CIA station cabled Langley saying Kubela wants to meet with either John or Robert Kennedy. So now somebody here was talking about the Kennedy Library. I had a researcher who went to the Kennedy Library looking at Bobby Kennedy's phone records. And here on October 10th, 1963 at 2:30, there was a phone call from Desmond Fitzgerald, and Bobby Kennedy took the call. That cable saying that Kubela wanted to meet with the Kennedys, that came into the CIA at 1:30 in the afternoon. By 2:30, Desmond Fitzgerald's calling Robert Kennedy. There's no record of what that call was about. But, this is what plausible denial means. You may find one record, but there's no backup. But there were plenty of CIA documents saying they did have a plan for flying Kubela back on a military aircraft, putting him up at a Washington safe house, and having him meet with Robert Kennedy. That became unnecessary, as it turned out. Kubela agreed to something less than that. And what he agreed to was an October 29th meeting in Paris with Desmond Fitzgerald, except Fitzgerald was appearing under an alias as James Clark. They met at a safe house. Desmond Fitzgerald said, I'm Bobby Kennedy's personal representative. Kubela knew that Bobby Kennedy ran things, so this works. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy and Fitzgerald knew each other quite well. They both lived in Georgetown, or Bobby Kennedy lived out in Virginia, but Desmond Fitzgerald would ride horses with him on weekends. So they meet in Paris on October 29th. Fitzgerald says, I can assure you the Kennedys support you. We will not let you down. The next day they hear back from him that he's satisfied with the policy, but he still wants those weapons. And in addition to a rifle with telescopic sight, he wanted some kind of poison secret device, like a pen or a dart gun, he could carry on his person in case he got in with Castro and had to kill him. So the calendar looks like this for October. And that is, Oswald came back from Mexico City on the 3rd of October. The meeting with Kubela about the Kennedys was on, the request to meet with the Kennedys was on October 10th. And on October 29th, they actually met with Kubela in Paris and said that. And then in Vietnam, the next day, on November 1st, President Diem of Vietnam is assassinated. Military coup. They drove the tanks into Saigon. Diem was considered weak and not a strong enough anti-communist, so he was overthrown. Standard way you do a coup. The military came in, took over the town, and they took President Diem and his brother out in the woods and killed them. Now, this church committee that I was on concluded that the CIA did not do that coup. Regardless, in 2013, Newsweek still reports the news that the CIA was behind that assassination. My point is not whether or not the CIA was actually involved. The important thing is, what did Castro think? If Castro knew that the CIA had met with Kubela on October 29th, and then 3 days later, Diem is killed, Castro's got to be saying, I'm next. So the November looks like this with the Kubela meeting in Paris, the Diem assassination. And then on November 11th, Fitzgerald had his last briefing with John Kennedy. And he basically said, look, we're all set up. We've made a lot of progress on this coup. There's no mention of assassination. We've got people involved. We've made a lot of progress. And I only note, sort of ironically, that on the 11th, that's Veterans Day, John Kennedy was at Arlington Cemetery for a Veterans Day memorial. And at the end, he turned to Secretary of Defense McNamara And he said, "This is a beautiful spot. Someday I'd like to be." So, and then on the 22nd, he's assassinated. So less than 2 weeks later, he's assassinated. I want to go back because I'm now going to talk about this last week of the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. We're going to start with Monday the 18th. On Monday the 18th, Kennedy went to Florida, and this is him in Tampa. This is the same car in which he was assassinated, the same driver. This was taken at a baseball stadium there. You can see there's no protection whatsoever, except a couple of Secret Service agents. Same thing in Dallas. And as part of Kennedy's first re-election bid, he's testing out Florida, the southern state. That night, he went down to Miami. And in Miami, he spoke to the Inter-American Press Association. The media from all over Latin America are there in Miami to hear his speech. He's got a microphone in front of him. This is his chance to send a message to Kubela. He couldn't speak to him directly. He didn't speak to him directly. But he can stand here with a microphone, and that's going to go into Havana and all over Latin America. The CI wrote this part of his speech. It is important to restate what now divides Cuba from my country and from the other countries of this hemisphere. It is the fact that a small band of conspirators has stripped the Cuban people of their freedom. This and this alone divides us. As long as this is true, nothing is possible. Without it, everything is possible. Once this barrier, meaning Castro, is removed, we'll be ready and anxious to work with the Cuban people. So this is the message Kubela has wanted him to give to Kubela and to all the dissidents in Havana and Cuba that might support him. And on Monday, November 18th, Kennedy delivers that message where everybody can hear it. Ironically, when I was doing my research, Cuban radio had the rebuttal to this on before Kennedy gave the speech. That's how good Cuban intelligence was. So now I bring in, it's Tuesday, November 19th. Bring in Richard Helms. On Tuesday, November 19th, Kubela calls up the CIA in Paris and says, "I've got to go back to Havana." If he does that, everything is off because they can't contact him again. So that message comes into the CIA, and like that October 10th message, within an hour or so of getting that message, Richard Helms, the number 2 man at the CIA, goes to the Justice Department to meet with Robert Kennedy. Now, no one knew this until in 2004, Richard Helms' memoirs were published after his death, purposefully after his death. And he says, on that day, on that Tuesday afternoon, I went down to the Justice Department with a colleague who was carrying an automatic weapon. Castro was exporting the revolution. We found a whole cache of weapons from Cuba in Venezuela. We had what Kennedy had always said freed him of a military invasion of Cuba. We had proof that Castro was exporting the revolution. So he told that to Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy said, "Well, you got to go tell John." Now, why he had to tell John, in hindsight, this doesn't seem terribly important at all. But this is the CIA, this is the White House calendar. There's Richard Helms and Herschel Peake at 6:15 at night at the White House on Tuesday meeting with John Kennedy. It's a very innocuous meeting in Helms's memoirs. In fact, he jokes that after they got to the meeting, he said, "By the way, we walked into the White House with this automatic weapon, this machine gun, and the Secret Service didn't stop us." And John Kennedy says, "It gives me a lot of confidence in him." But he'd be killed 4 days later. That wasn't the only. There's also a CIA memo, which you can't read, but this is by the case officer who met with Kubela saying, this is dated November 19th, and it says, "I got authority today to give Kubela assassination weapons." He actually says sniper rifles, which is, of course, what they used to kill Kennedy. And go ahead with meeting with him. But that's not all that happened that day. Kennedy had been meeting with this man, Jean Daniel, who was a French reporter working for the New Republic. Kennedy had this, what was called two-track policy. One track is get rid of Castro by assassination. The other track is negotiate with him. And you do both at once and see which works. So his second track was to work through Jean Daniel as sort of his little informal conduit to Fidel Castro. And in October, John Kennedy has sat down with him and given him an interview about his thoughts about rapprochement with Cuba. He's gone down to Havana trying to get a meeting interview with Fidel Castro. Castro doesn't respond until that night, the night of November 19th. Castro calls him up, says, come on over, and they meet from 10 o'clock at night to 4 a.m. the next morning with Castro asking about Kennedy, also being very hostile about Kennedy. So that's going on that week. The next day, Wednesday, the 20th, the CIA calls Kubela in Paris and says, we'd like to meet with you on Friday, November 22nd. Kubela says, will the meeting be interesting? And the CIA, and he's got someone in the room with him, so he can't talk freely. And the CIA says, we don't know if it's going to be interesting, but it's the meeting you requested. I interviewed the man who was orchestrating this, and I said, what did you mean by the meeting you requested? He said, well, he would have understood we were going to give him assassination weapons. So on November 20th, Wednesday, he knows he'll get assassination weapons. Now, come back finally to Oswald. Oswald had moved from New Orleans to Dallas, except his wife was living apart from him. She lived in the suburbs. He's living downtown in a rooming house. He's got a job at the book depository. Nothing unusual is going on. That night, he comes home from work, but to get out to his wife's house, he has a friend at the book depository who lives out there, and so he can get a ride with him on weekends, and he usually goes out to see his wife on weekends. But it's Wednesday night, November 20th. Oswald does not have that rifle. It's out at his wife's house. He makes no move to get that rifle until the next morning, Thursday, November 21st. He walks into the book depository. He finds his friend. He said, I need a ride to my wife's house. That night, they went out there. He spent the night, but he got the rifle and came back to the book depository with the rifle. In law, it's called an overt act. He commits no overt act to commit an assassination until Thursday morning, when he went in to ask his colleague to give him a ride because he didn't have his rifle, meaning that he had not made the decision to kill Kennedy by the time he left work the night before. And then, of course, on Friday, Kennedy comes into Dallas. Oswald shoots and kills him. I'm not a believer in all the other conspiracy theories. He's arrested by police and then he's shot. But that's Friday, November 22nd. What else is going on? Well, in Paris, at exact moment Kennedy is killed, the CIA is meeting with Kubela. And they show him a copy of the speech that Kennedy gave about removing the barrier in Cuba. They say, we'll drop assassination rifles for you in Cuba so you don't have to carry them back. And here's a poison pen you can use to stab Castro if you need it. That meeting is broken up by a phone call saying Kennedy's been assassinated. And everything is off. Well, it doesn't say everything is off. The CIA got very wishy-washy about what happened at that meeting. But finally, in Havana, Castro has called up Jean Daniel, the reporter, and said, I'd like to meet with you again. So Jean Daniel is having lunch with Castro in Havana at the very moment Kennedy is killed, and they hear on the radio, they bring in a radio because they're saying Kennedy's been shot in Dallas, and Castro says, oh my God, this is terrible. And John Daniel is there. John Daniel then wrote all this up for the New Republic, and at the end of his article, he says, and Castro's final question to me was, what authority does Lyndon Johnson exercise over the CIA? So what I've shown you is all this stuff on the 18th. Kennedy goes to Florida, gives the barrier speech. On the 19th, Kubela says, I'm going back to Havana. Helms meets with Robert and John Kennedy, and Castro gives an interview to Jean Daniel on Wednesday. They call Kubela and said, we're going to have a meeting with you on Friday to give you what you want. And Oswald must have made the decision to kill Kennedy that night, or somehow makes a decision, because the next day, the 21st, he gets a ride out to his wife's house to get the rifle. And on Friday, John Kennedy is assassinated. The CIA has met with Kubela in Paris, and Jean Daniel has an interview with Castro. The only man in government who knew everything I've just told you is Richard Helms. And he was the CIA point man with the Warren Commission that investigated the assassination. At no point did he ever tell the Warren Commission, or did the Warren Commission ever learn what you've learned tonight. After that, on December 19th, 1963, Lyndon Johnson is president. You know, it's amazing what you can do with research. This is the actual photograph of the meeting that I got from the Johnson Library. There's Lyndon Johnson talking to the CIA, and he's not happy. This is all the meeting with all the people involved in Cuba. And he's talking directly to Desmond Fitzgerald, and he says, someday we're going to have to answer to the grand jury of public opinion for what you've been doing in Cuba. And he ordered the assassination plot, the whole Kubela stuff ended. He actually ordered the entire operations against Cuba ended. It was ended by the summer of 1964. All the agents in Cuba the CIA had were rolled up, meaning they were arrested by Castro. And Lyndon Johnson decided to end a covert war in Cuba to stop communism, and go 9,000 miles away to Vietnam and have an overt war to stop communism. So you have to think with Richard Helms, why didn't he tell people? And I think the obvious answer is, I think he's a good civil servant, a good, loyal American. I think he must have had authority from Lyndon Johnson. If you were deputy director of the CIA, you would not hide something from the Warren Commission without authority, but maybe he did. Finally, one of the small facts I go in the book is about this man, Gilberto Lopez. He was living in Tampa when Kennedy was there. That November 18th, when Kennedy was in Tampa, he was there. And then the next day, he went to Texas. And he was in Texas on November 22nd. The border was closed to Mexico that day. He was stuck at the border trying to get into Mexico the day of the assassination. He ended up getting into Mexico as soon as that was open that night, went down to Mexico City, and got there on the 25th. And on the November 27th, he was the sole passenger on a Cubana airline flight to Havana. This picture was taken of him at the airport in Mexico City flying to Havana. It's nighttime. He's wearing sunglasses. He obviously knows people are taking pictures of him and doesn't want to be recognized. The CIA later learned that Mexican police said he was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. Again, that was never told to the Warren Commission. So, there are all these little things I found where what you would consider highly relevant facts were never given the Warren Commission. Johnny Roselli in 1967 started telling people, a reporter, that there were plots to assassinate Castro, and Castro had retaliated. And in fact, he said there were multiple assassins in more than one city. That went up to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was very concerned, and I think that relates to his Murder, Inc., where Roselli said that Castro had retaliated. Johnny Roselli, I interviewed him for the Senate committee. He was murdered. His body was found in a 55-gallon drum in Biscayne Bay about 6 months later. Sam Giancana, I showed you earlier, he was murdered under subpoena to that committee. And finally, the Warren report didn't want you to think of Oswald as a James Bond. Because in 1963, everybody thought they were super spies. So they wrote that Oswald was moved by an overriding hostility environment. He expressed his hatred of American society and acted in protest against it. Oswald's search for what he conceived to be the perfect society was doomed from the start. He saw for himself a place in history, a role as the great man who would be recognized as having been in advance of his time. So they're trying to disprove that he could be an assassin. And this is what the Soviet, the fellow who formed Department 13 of the KGB on assassinations, this is his advice for recruiting assassins. Go search for people who are hurt by fate or nature, the ugly, those suffering from an inferiority complex. The sense of belonging to an influential and powerful organization will give them a feeling of superiority over the handsome and prosperous people. For the first time in their lives, they will experience a sense of importance. It is sad indeed and humanly shallow, but we are obliged to profit from it. In other words, what the Warren Commission described of Oswald psychology was precisely what not only the Soviets would look for in an assassin, but also what their surrogates like Cuba would look for. There were all these 4 investigations: the Warren Commission in 64, the Rockefeller Commission in 75, the Church Committee in 76, the House Assassination Committee in 1978. And Richard Helms testified multiple times to those committees, and never once did he mention those meetings with the Kennedys on November 19th.